If you enjoy having access to the great outdoors, then you don't want to skip this video because public lands in the United States are under attack. Hello and welcome to the channel. As always, I'm your host, Morgan. I'm not going to beat around the bush with a cute little intro this time because the current administration has put our public lands in the United States in danger of being completely destroyed, and I really wish that that were hyperbole. I have my notes here, so that means it's time for you to grab your snowflake drink of choice, and let's get into this. Hey, I don't do this very often, but if you resonate with this message, please share this video. I care very deeply about the message I'm trying to spread, and if we are going to be able to make a difference and change the course that this current administration is trying to force us onto, then it is very time sensitive right now. So please consider sharing this video far and wide. Also, if you find any value here, please consider giving it a like. If you have thoughts that you would like to contribute to the conversation, please put them down in the comment section below. If you want to see more of me and my videos recommended to you, please consider clicking that subscribe button. I'd really appreciate it. Okay, that's all. Let's get back to the video now. At the end of February, images of an American flag hung upside down off the face of El Capitan in Yosemite National Park went absolutely viral. This flag was hung in an act of visible protest after around 1,000 National Park Service staff members and around 3,400 U.S. Forest Service employees were indiscriminately fired and important funds were frozen in the name of eliminating supposed wasteful government spending. It is important to note here that according to the National Parks Conservation Association, the entire budget for the United States national parks is less than 1/15 of 1% of the entire federal budget. But the national parks actually generate billions more in revenue thanks to the thousands of visitors that they get each and every year. So go ahead and mull that thought over for a little bit. On Saturday, March 1st, thousands of people across the nation flocked to our national parks to protest not only the firing of these essential workers, but also the legislation and executive orders coming out of Washington, D.C. that are putting these pristine places in peril. We will talk more about this legislation and the executive orders later in this video. Because of these firings and funding freezes, expect your next excursion into the great outdoors to look very different this year than it ever has before. Expect to see things like extra long wait times, closed amenities and visitor centers, more trash strewn about, very dirty restrooms, poorly maintained roads, poorly or unmaintained trails, and potentially unhealthy habitats and sick wildlife. Please note that this list is not exhausted, and there will very likely be many more repercussions than what we have listed here. The people who were let go and the funds that were frozen are the lifeblood that keep our public lands open for us to enjoy and also running and in that pristine or near pristine condition that we as a nation can be proud of. In my experience, it does not matter what side of the political spectrum that one falls on, because most people seem to be able to agree that these places are worth preserving and protecting so that countless people can enjoy them for generations to come. They're not something that we should allow to be destroyed in the interest of making a buck. The benefits of the national parks, national monuments, national forests, etc., do not stop at their borders. The communities that surround them actually rely on that yearly tourism and visitation to stimulate their own economies. So any decision that is made that will hurt the public land will also necessarily hurt those communities that rely on the tourism and the outdoor community that surrounds our public lands. Due to the budgets and staffing cuts, experts are expecting that the staff that does remain will not be able to keep up with the demands of the rapidly approaching peak outdoor recreation season. So, what exactly does that mean? It means that in addition to the poor conditions that I mentioned earlier, we should also expect to see closures, and that when all of this is factored together, it's ultimately going to result in less visitation and less revenue generated, which one can presume is probably one of the things that the current administration wants. But why would the current administration want that to happen? Well, it would give one very good reason in support of implementing the legislation and the executive orders currently coming out of Washington, D.C. So let's go ahead and take a look at them. Let's begin with H.R. 471, or the Fix Our Forest Act. This bill was introduced into the House of Representatives on January 16, 2025, and it was sponsored by Representative Bruce Westerman, a Republican from the state of Arkansas. This bill rapidly passed through the House on January 23rd and was then received by the Senate on January 28th, where it did sit for a little bit because it did not get its first official Senate committee meeting until March 6th of 2025. So what exactly does this bill do? Well, on the surface, if you look at the summary, this bill looks like it might actually be a good thing because it calls for things like establishing requirements for managing forests on federal lands, reducing wildfire threats. But the Fix Our Forest Act is not what it seems, and I'm going to talk about 3 big problems. Problem 1. The act calls for an accelerated environmental review process. What exactly does this mean? It means undermining the National Environmental Policy Act, which requires the environmental impacts of all major federal actions to be thoroughly considered, and the Endangered Species Act, which protects endangered species of plants and animals from extinction so that contracted vegetation management activities can occur. Which brings us to problem 2, the vegetation management activities themselves. What exactly are these activities? Logging. These activities are logging. The idea is that in order to prevent wildfire, they need to go in there and cut down all of the trees, which is actually counterintuitive because widespread logging will put those areas at greater risk of wildfire, not less. Why would cutting down the trees in a forest not prevent wildfire, you might ask? Well, thank you for asking, because I do actually have the explanation here for you. By removing those trees, what you're actually doing is exposing the ground and the surrounding vegetation to greater impacts from the sun and the wind as well. This means that the ground and the surrounding vegetation are actually going to dry out because they no longer have the protection that those trees provided. This newly dried out forest floor and vegetation is then the perfect fuel for wildfires. A lot of forest ecosystems, especially the ones we see here in North America, have actually evolved to thrive despite these natural wildfire cycles. The trees themselves have very thick bark and very high canopies, which helps protect them from the fire themselves. That thick bark provides protection to the very sensitive tissues inside the trunk, and then the high canopies keeps the photosynthetic tissues of the leaves or needles, whatever trees we happen to have there, out of the path of the flames themselves. And then thanks to those high canopies, the sensitive ecosystems that thrive near the forest floor are protected from the sun and the wind, which allows for those ecosystems to actually retain more moisture, which prevents them from drying out, which is another protection against those wildfires. And then, of course, another massive problem with widespread logging is destruction of habitat. Once you cut down millions of acres of old growth forest, you cannot get it back, at least not in our lifetimes. Because to be an old growth forest, that forest needs to be more than 160 years old. Cutting down these trees not only destroys the habitat and the old growth forest, it also opens up these areas to things like increased erosion. So you're likely to see mudslides if they're near communities of humans, then that's going to impact those communities. And it also gives invasive species the perfect place to move into. And these same invasive species also are very often big contributors to that increase in wildfire risk, especially if they are things like invasive grasses that have a very short growing cycle and then die off and dry out by the end of summer. So that's perfect fuel for wildfires. At the end of the day, these vegetation management activities are not actually for wildfire prevention, they're for private profit. And at this point, it's important to note that the companies that would be doing these vegetation management activities would in fact be private companies contracted by the government. And you can find the supporting evidence for that in the bill itself if you take the time to read it. The third big problem with the Fix Our Forest Act is that it will prevent citizens from holding these federal agencies accountable. Now, how will it do that, you might ask? And thank you for asking, because again, I've got the answer. It's going to do this by limiting the ability of the citizens to file lawsuits in regards to these vegetation management activities, and it's going to limit the ability of the public to even participate in the review process through things like public comment periods. Basically, if either of these things are deemed by a judge to slow down necessary vegetation management activities, then they can kind of just throw it out and use this act as the basis to do so. So if you even care about having a voice about what goes on around your community, then this act is a big red flag. To sum it up, the Fix Our Forest Act is little more than a legal endorsement of widespread logging on our public lands under the guise of wildfire prevention. We're not done yet, though, because we still need to talk about Donald Trump's executive orders and Secretary's Order 3418 from Secretary of the Interior Doug Burgum. I'm not going to read through every single one of Donald Trump's executive orders or even every single word of the Secretary's order, because at the end of the day, they're all working hand in hand to accomplish similar goals. Starting on day one, January 20th, 2025, Donald Trump got right to work signing a plethora of executive orders that impact pretty much everything, including our public lands. The executive orders that specifically impact our public lands have to do with things like reducing environmental protections, expanding fossil fuel extraction efforts, that drill baby drill thing that he loves to say, and expanding logging activities on national forests like the Tongass National Forest in Alaska. Secretary's Order 3418 basically just backs up Trump's executive orders about fossil fuel and mineral extraction by removing regulations and pushing for the identification of and leasing of public lands for those purposes. Basically, it means that our public lands are now in real danger of being sliced up and sold to the highest bidders so Trump can make good on his promise to, again, drill, baby, drill, and line the pockets of oil executives. Just like how our forests are destroyed when they're logged into oblivion, lands that are drilled on are destroyed, and we will never be able to get them back to their original condition. Increased drilling and mining also leads to increased pollution and accelerates climate change, which impacts everyone and everything in one way or another. In addition to all of these executive orders and firings, they're also talking about canceling the leases of buildings that the national parks and monuments rely on for their everyday operations. Buildings that serve as climate-controlled museums for artifacts and headquarters. So they are basically not even being subtle about these efforts to undermine the one thing that honestly anyone on any side of the political spectrum should be able to agree upon. If you've made it this far into the video and you're sitting there wondering if there's any way for you to make a difference, I have good news for you, because at this point, at time of recording, it is not too late for us to make our voices heard and potentially stop our nation from going down the path that Donald Trump and his billionaire buddies want us to travel down. The first thing that you should do is get in touch with your representatives and let them know exactly how you feel about protecting and preserving public land. Be sure to let them know that you are a voter, assuming that you are of legal age and legal status to vote. And not only that you're a voter, but that you vote in primaries. That part is actually the important part, especially if your representative is a Democrat, because primaries are where an incumbent will lose their seat to a member of the same party. This might feel like you're threatening their job, and that's because you are. If our representatives are not representing their constituents, then they deserve to lose their seat or job. If you're unsure of how to get in touch with your representatives, please head over to 5calls.org. I have linked it down in the description below for you. This is a site that will help you get in touch with your representatives, and it also has scripts for you to use if you would like. And not just about this issue, but about pretty much any issue that you might deem important enough to call your representative about. The next thing that you should do is head over to the National Parks Conservation Association's website to see how you can donate and get involved. They also have a handy dandy little form that has a letter to the representatives already typed up. All you need to do is add your information and click send, and they will send it off so that you can digitally add your voice to the noise as well. Because we're not going to be able to stop things and save our public lands if we do not make our voices heard. Which brings me to the last and potentially most important thing you can do, and that is to stay informed and keep spreading the word. I know that right now it feels like the billionaires have just been given free rein to do whatever they want. But together we are mighty and we can stop them. But that is only if we refuse to just sit idly by and let it happen. Together, we can make a difference. but only if we refuse to be silent until that silence is forced upon us. That's all I have for you today. As always, all of my source material is linked down in the description below, and maybe more so than ever, I highly recommend that you go check them out. There are quite a few of them, but they do go into a lot more detail about all of these topics that I've talked about today than I have time to go into in this video. And also, it's a good idea to practice your fact-checking skills because who am I but a girl on the internet? If you found any value here, please consider clicking that like button and consider sharing this video, especially since our call to action is kind of time sensitive at this point. If you have any thoughts that you want to contribute to the conversation, please put them down in the comment section below. If you want to see more of me and my content recommended to you, please consider clicking that subscribe button. I would really appreciate it. Or you can also find me on all of the other platforms. I'm most active on TikTok and Instagram, so come join me over there. If you hated everything I had to say here and think I have no idea what I'm talking about, go ahead and let me know down in the comments. I would be very interested in having that conversation with you. No matter what you decide to do, I do hope that you have a wonderful rest of your day, afternoon, evening, what have you, and I will see you all in the next one.